Hello and welcome to this new episode of the long-term reading project on Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain. So this video is part of a long series and you can find all previous episodes compiled here in this playlist. Today we are starting with the 7th chapter of the novel, and we will look at the first 3 episodes or sub-chapters within that novel. And these 3 episodes have the titles By the Ocean of Time, Mynheer Peeperkorn, and Vingt. And as usual, this video is structured into chapters, and I will briefly show you the overview of my video chapters here, but you can also select individual chapters by using the timestamps below. Okay, first chapter, the plot of these episodes. As usual, the plot is actually very quickly told. The opening of the chapter, this episode, By the Ocean of Time, has no real plot. It consists more or less of the narrator's reflections on time, on the nature of time, and on the different ways of experiencing time, of recounting time, and how to narrate time. But then something actually happens in the second and third episode. The long-awaited and repeatedly announced return of Clawdia. But oh dear, she doesn't return alone, but she is with another man, with an imposing man, or rather an imposing wreck of a man, a rich colonial Dutchman, a man of grand gestures, a true lover of all sensual pleasures, a personality bordering on caricature with this theatrical but incomprehensible way of speaking, and his imperious majesty, and his longing for stimulants such as alcohol, caffeine, and above all, sumptuous food, and his ranting about the simple pleasures of life and refreshments. And when we then we see how this unfolds in real life in the episode with the French title Vingt, that means 21. And so there happens a spontaneous little orgy, so a bacchanal, and where under the supervision of this master of ceremonies, Mynheer Peeperkorn, a group of 12 people, they drink and eat to excess. And even the Grandmaster, Mynheer Peeperkorn himself, he reaches his limits, and he has to be led to his bedroom by Clawdia and Hans. And at the end, then there is a somewhat embarrassing scene because Hans refuses to follow Peeperkorn's suggestion to kiss Clawdia on the forehead. So far, so good. So not that much happening. Let's now take a closer look at these 3 episodes, and one after the other, and take a closer look at their themes, their special features, and their role in the structure of the novel. Okay, second chapter of the video, the first episode of chapter 7, By the Ocean of Time. So this is, let's say, an appropriate subtitle of this episode would be just another piece of speculation on the nature of time. So this episode begins quite familiarly with some reflections on the nature of time. So this is nothing new to us. On first reading of this episode, one might think also what the point of this all is. We have already heard or read it all before a couple of times in the novel so far. So this speculation about whether and how time can be narrated, how we perceive time, and whether it is an absolute or a relative entity. And of course, time itself cannot be narrated. Time in a narrative, it arises through the relationship between the events that are narrated and how they are narrated. So and then the author is telling us a little bit that we have to differentiate between the narrated time, so that's the time that passes on the level of the story. So and on the other hand, there's the narrative time. So that is the time that passes for the reader or for the listener while listening or reading to the narrative. Okay, so I think these are nowadays these are plain vanilla concepts in literature analysis. If people are looking at how a specific piece of prose deals with the matter of time. And we have heard all these speculations and thoughts from the narrator several times. But there's usually some small new element in there. These ruminations on the nature of time, they usually have two specific features. On the one hand, there is usually a hidden evaluative comment on how time should be handled or managed correctly. So the narrator usually calls this a proper management of time. And on the other hand, another second feature that often comes in these parts is that the narrator often adds one specific new perspective on the perception of time. As a reminder, one of the first concept was about how to measure time. Then it was about time being not an absolute but a relative entity. Then how time can also be imagined as something cyclical, and so on. And here too, we have this more evaluative comment on the proper management of time and a new aspect of time. So there's a warning issued against a certain certain type of bad time management. And a new concept of time is introduced for good reasons, as we will see in the following two episodes. The warning is issued here against a kind of pathological way to enjoy time or to enjoy oneself in relation to time. So it's what is actually warned against or condemned are any attempts to artificially compress or stretch time. So by talking excessively long about something that only lasts a few minutes, or using drugs such as opium to stretch a short period of time in one's individual inner experience into hours, days, or even years while being intoxicated. So, and the author calls these are vicious dreams. So this is not good time management. And one notices that the narrator seems to have this idea or this ideal of the inner self being always in sync with the actual external cause of time, with the objective time. So we should not ignore time. So that would be, as the narrator calls it, the worst kind of recklessness, not to respect time. But we should also not try to stretch or to compress it. Instead, we should try to live the moment as it is, as it presents itself. So today, it sounds like a familiar concept, like what we today call mindfulness. So this is not that new. Any further speculation about how to deal with time and how to experience time, the author or the narrator is rejecting it, because that's a matter for professional thinkers who can afford to engage in such thought experiments. Maybe this relates to Einstein's discovery of the relativity of time, an idea that was just becoming known and a bit popular at the time The Magic Mountain was written. So, but the narrator said, okay, that's for professional thinkers, but for us normal people, such speculation that confuses the different categories of time, that is a cause for great concerns. Okay, so I think so far so clear. This is also a dig at Hans, who had walked into the trap of bad time management in the past, as the narrator has often commented. But then the narrator introduces this new perspective of time, a new concept of time. So, and now I quote from the text. The teachers of the Middle Ages wanted to know that time was an illusion. Its passage in causality and consequence merely the result of advice of our senses. And the true being of things was as standing now. Was he walking by the sea, this doctor who first conceived this idea with a faint bitterness of eternity on his lips? End of quote. So here this idea of a timeless eternity, of something that is beyond time comes into play, and a dimension where time does not play a role at all, where it is as a standstill. So for us humans, there is this illusion of time as a sequence, but the true nature of things is not subject to time and to development. It's an eternal now. And some English translations here talk about the philosopher to whom this thought first came. But the German original literally says the doctor to whom this thought first came. And this is, I think, is an important, the choice of words is important here, the doctor, because in the context, in the context about medieval philosophers, the doctor is always a code name that clearly refers to Thomas Aquinas. So that was his nickname, so to say. So Thomas Aquinas is called in philosophy the doctor. And Thomas Aquinas actually, he formulated this idea of time as an eternal now, or as a standing present. In Latin, it's called nunc stans. So this idea is often related to the doctor, to Thomas Aquinas, but actually the idea can also be found in previous forms in earlier writings, in the writings of Boethius and of Albertus Magnus. So nunc stans, the standing now, the eternal present, that is the divine thing, that the divine timeless now, and the divine presence. So, and it's an expression of a timeless eternity in contrast to the human now, the human, which is just a small point in a flowing time. So God's eternity is a timeless now, an eternal present. So, and this is where it gets interesting in terms of links to religious history and religious concepts in general. So because for the reference to a timeless present, to a timeless event, is something that is a key concept in religious studies. It is thought as a very almost universal characteristic of myth, and above all also as a core element of almost any religious ritual. So across many religions, at the core of religious rituals, or at least at the core of the essential rituals that constitute the respective religion and that are repeated in a certain annual cycle, for example, at the core of this is the idea that that the believers they reenact and reperform a myth, and by doing this they are bringing an timeless eternal truth into the present. So actualizing or reactualizing this eternal truth, bringing it back into the human present. And thus, even though one is in time, we as human beings, we are participating in this sort of external and timeless truth. So for those who are interested in learning more about this concept from the religious studies perspective, I can recommend two books by the Romanian religious scholar Mircea Eliade. You think he's really one of the most influential religious scholars of the 20th century. Two of his books explain this concept in detail with a lot of examples from various religions. So it's the book the Sacred and the Profane, and Cosmos and History. And in these two books, he explains this concept of time and its close connection to myth and religious ritual very beautifully. So why am I harping on about this? I believe it is no coincidence that the narrator introduces this particular view of time here, because my hypothesis is that what will follow in this and the second and the third episode, this Bacchanal in particular, in the episode Vingt, that this is actually presented to us and narrated and structured like a myth, like the reenactment or like the reactualization of a myth. And so a myth performing a ritual is described as the realization of a reactualization of a religious truth. And I will explain this in more detail when we look at the following episode, but I think it's worth mentioning that in this very first episode, where nothing happens with regard to the plot, so these speculations about time, it's not useless or harmless speculation about time. The narrator does it on purpose. He lays the conceptual foundation for this religious and mythological background for everything that happens later in this Bacchanal, in the episode Vingt. So, and the typical irony of Thomas Mann is that he immediately invalidates this understanding of time, declaring it almost inadmissible, so or only admissible in exceptional cases. So I quote from the text: "We must repeat that, as for us, we have been speaking only of the lawful license of a holiday, of fantasies born of leisure, of which the well-conducted mind wearies as quickly as a vigorous man does of lying in the warm sand." So it's not actually fully impossible and not forbidden, but it's an exception. It's only permissible and sensible in the short term, only in exceptional cases, and only temporarily, to think about time in this way. And then he does exactly what he has just declassified as a license for holiday, or license for holidays only. A second point that I find interesting about this episode is that the narrator finally abandons his ironic distance with regard to the core characters of the novel. And now in this episode, he makes unusually clear statements and assessments how he sees these characters. He has been, in the previous chapters, he has been very restrained in this regard up to now. So the characters were talking, okay, they were judging each other, they were talking about each other and assessing the behavior of others, but the narrator himself remained very reserved, never taking sides between Settembrini and Nafta, for example. Only in relation to Hans did he occasionally express some mild criticism, but always in a very benevolent way. But now he makes some very clear judgments. So, and we see this in towards the end of this first episode. In the last sentence of the episode, for example, Behrens is described as a melancholy blusterer. Actually, I would rather translate the German word Schwadronneur a bit stronger, for example, like as windbag or a bloviator. So melancholy windbag or melancholy bloviator. So this is a clear slap in the face for Hofrat Behrens. A few sentences earlier, Joachim is clearly evaluated in a very positive way. There's talk of the one departed who was dear to us, and also his ethics of duty. The idea of duty, of self-discipline is discussed here in a very affirmative, approving manner. And in this episode, there's a clear judgment about Settembrini and Nafta. So, and this is where it gets interesting. The narrator clearly takes sides with Settembrini and against Nafta. And in relation to Nafta, he takes side against Nafta, even in the form of an anonymous condemnation or a clear statement against someone whose name must not even be mentioned. So the first condemnation of Nafta is still quite indirect. So we can only, a quote from the text, we can only be grateful to a man like Mr. Settembrini, who, with pedagogic dogmatism, characterized metaphysics as the evil principle. And so this is clearly directed against Nafta's metaphysical positions. And it becomes even clearer on the second page of the second episode, when it comes to reassuring the readers about the appearance of Mynheer Peeperkorn. We'll talk about this, and right, let's talk about it right now. It's true that, I quote again from the text, it is true that this part of our story might, like an earlier chapter, bear the caption, "A Newcomer." But the reader need not fear that in him another occasion for pedagogic strife has arrived upon the scene. No, Mynheer Peeperkorn was not the man to be the bearer of logical confusion. So now that's really quite clear and obvious. A newcomer was the title of the episode or the section in which Nafta was introduced as a new character. And here, this character that had been introduced in this episode is indirectly referred to as the bearer of strife and of logical confusion. So with regards to Nafta, a very telling silence. So his name is not mentioned, but his behavior, his positions are, his metaphysics is branded as the evil principle, and his actions are branded as pedagogic strife and logical confusion. So it's a double condemnation, and one could also speak also of a structural exclusion because his name isn't mentioned. So pretty clear and devastating for the reputation of Nafta. So let's summarize what emerges as the narrator's attitude in this episode. One might finally say that the narrator supports this combination of humanistic enlightenment, represented by Settembrini, and this bourgeois ethical duty, represented by Joachim. And he strongly rejects this radical metaphysics and this obscurantism and the pedagogical and logical confusion that is introduced by Nafta. So he favors, and the narrator favors a life in the here and now, a life in sync with time, but in exceptional cases only, as a kind of a holiday license, he considered it permissible to connect with the timeless, with the standing now, or with the eternal present. So in the way it is done in religious rituals that are reactualizing or reenacting myths. So, and my theory or my thesis is that the last 2 points are exactly what the narrator then is going to show us in the character, in the behavior of Mynheer Peeperkorn. A life completely focused on the here and now and celebrated like a religious ritual, like a myth brought into life, with a strange mixture of Christian and Dionysian elements. And this is then the very opposite of the very rational attitudes to life that had been demonstrated earlier by Settembrini and by Nafta. But more on that later. Third chapter of the video, let's talk about Mynheer Peeperkorn, the third teacher, I would say. So Clawdia Shusha has returned, but she is accompanied by a new lover, by this Mynheer Peeperkorn. And this is a bitter blow for Hans. All his expectations and everything he had imagined about his reunion with Clawdia, all this vanishes like a pipe dream. The brutal reality is that he has been rejected and replaced by this old man. Like Clawdia is involved with someone else, and she even demonstratively ignores Hans. And although the strange or interesting thing is, although Peeperkorn is clearly the rival who has got his chance, still Hans himself, he cannot escape the impression that made by this imposing personality, a visually imposing figure, a man with an incredible presence and dominance, with a kind of natural charisma that immediately attracts people's attention and admiration, however grotesque and his gestures and his incoherent speech may be. So, but why does this new character appear in the novel? A character to whom four entire episodes are devoted. That's an interesting question, I think. So there's a broad agreement or consensus in the academic literature on the Magic Mountain that most people seem to think that Peeperkorn is introduced here as a sort of a third teacher for Hans, a third mentor. So as a deliberate counterpoint to Settembrini and Nafta. And I think that makes perfect sense, because it has become very obvious and apparent that things cannot continue as they are with these two, and with their debates and their struggle for the attention of Hans. So during the last debate we witnessed, which concerned the role of literature and of humanistic education, it became very clear that the dispute between those two had become deadlocked and worn out. It was going nowhere. It was more of a dispute for the sake of disputing, and Hans and Joachim did not even listen to the end, but they left early. And so, and I think that now we are just at a point in the novel where there need to be some change or introduce something new, because on the one hand, the positions of the two, Nafta and Settembrini, and their opposition that has become very clear even to the most inattentive reader. We have Settembrini, who stands for reason and enlightenment and all the humanistic ideas, language and progress and humanism. And then there's Nafta as this radical metaphysics, Jesuitism, always in favor of dogmatic and radical authorities of all kinds, and even if they represent inhumane ideologies, or even if they promote inhuman measures and cruel actions against humans. So, but what they, as different as they are, but what they have in common is that they view life from a purely intellectual perspective. Both are shrewd, highly educated rhetoricians, but they are all about gray theory. And a counterpoint was missing, a counterpoint that advocates for a more holistic view of life, and a counterpoint that demonstrates other more sensual attitudes towards life. And Peeperkorn presents such an extreme, almost caricatured counterpoint. It's a man bursting with hunger for life. He worships the enjoyment of life, not the intellect. It's all about vitalism, about eating and drinking and carnal desire and lust and physical presence, and no rhetoric at all. So he may perform all these pompous gestures, but he can't formulate a single coherent sentence. So he's the opposite of a rhetorician. And yet that doesn't do the slightest harm to his effect on people. So he is the one that is admired and whose authority is not questioned at all, but simply followed. And it's personality instead of spirit, and physical presence instead of intellect. It's enjoyment and actual action instead of rhetoric. And so that's the world of Peter Peeperkorn, and that is his role. When it comes to describing Peeperkorn, the German author and Nobel Prize laureate Gerhard Hauptmann is usually referred to as the model or the template for Peeperkorn's outward appearance. And so a sparse goatee, a head of white hair, lancet-like fingernails, the quirk of opening his eyes wide and leaving incomplete sentences hanging in the air. All this is Gerhard Hauptmann, how his contemporaries recognized him. And so people noticed quickly that this Peeperkorn might be a caricature of Gerhard Hauptmann. And Gerhard Hauptmann himself, he noticed this as well, and he was not amused. He wrote a letter of complaint to his publisher, who was, by the way, the same publisher that Thomas Mann used. So the publisher just forwarded this letter of complaint to Thomas Mann, and then Thomas Mann reacted very quickly. He wrote a long apologetic letter to Hauptmann, and they were quickly reconciled, so no scandal at all. So, of course, so this Peeperkorn is partly inspired by Gerhard Hauptmann. This is certainly all true, but I think this is all very superficial. I think there's a more profound meaning of the way this Mynheer Peeperkorn is characterized. And I have a theory of my own, which I will try to substantiate in the text, a theory that Thomas Mann subtly takes up this East-West theme again, that had played a role in the novel earlier. And so he portrays Peeperkorn as a synthesis of the East and the West. And whether this synthesis is successful or not, we will see. My hypothesis is that Peeperkorn, who is explicitly described as a colonial Dutchman from Java, or Java, how do you pronounce it? I don't know. Is that this colonial Dutchman is in fact what used to be called a mixed race person, or a mestizo, meaning that he had not only Dutch but also Javanese ancestors. And how do I come to this hypothesis? He is explicitly described as a colonial Dutchman of slightly colored nationality. And the English translation I'm reading, it says slightly faded nationality, but that's a clear translation mistake. So the German original says leicht farbige Nationalität, and farbig means colored or off color. So slightly colored what would be the correct translation. And okay, this could mean just sunburned skin, or colored in the sense that he brings something exotic to the spectrum of nationalities present at the Berghof. But these doesn't seem plausible to me. These are second level meanings of this word. So the more natural, more common, and more direct meaning of the words leichtfarbige Nationalität, slightly colored nationality, that implies a mixed ethnicity to me. So the second clue for me is that the narrator makes a brief digression to mention distinctly colored guests at the Berghof, and this Egyptian princess and her Moorish travel companion. And then comes the sentence, and yeah, Mynheer Peeperkorn then, compared with such phenomena, might seem well nigh colorless. So first, he is of colored nationality compared to the majority of Berghof patients, but then he is almost colorless compared to the Egyptian woman and her Moorish travel companion. So this makes clear that color, that this refers to skin color. So then I read this as that these 1.5 pages, right? In these 1.5 pages, the narrator represents a color spectrum from ranging from white to black, and an ethnic spectrum from east to west, Occident and Orient, and with Peeperkorn located in the middle as a synthesis, a mixture between the two parts of the world. And my third argument is that Peeperkorn's character as a Dutch citizen in this novel, a Dutch who, by the way, speaks perfect German. This only really makes sense if one wants to place a socially acceptable mixed race person in the midst of this Berghof society in the period before the First World War at the beginning of the 20th century. This would have been impossible with mixed race people from any other European colonial power. At that time, so-called mixed race individuals, mixed between European colonial rulers and the Oriental colonized people. In general, for almost all European colonial powers, these mixed race people were not socially accepted figures for the European middle class or upper class. But only with the Dutch it was different. The ethnic policy of the Dutch in Java was really a unique exception among the European colonial powers. The Dutch East India Company explicitly encouraged marriage between Dutch men and local Asian women, and the children from these marriages, they were socially equal to ethnic Dutch people. So, and this was a very special Dutch exception. Only here in the Netherlands and with Dutch people, it was conceivable that somebody with a Javanese grandmother or Javanese great-grandmother could be a successful and socially accepted rich man, a coffee planter, and accepted also by the society of the colonial power in his homeland, and by means of that acceptance then also acceptable for people in other European countries. So, so the fact that he still seems somewhat dodgy to the German bourgeois society, for example, because his pockets are arranged in a vertical way, as is the case with working class people in the German-speaking countries at the time. So this may reveal a little a hint of class prejudice. But actually, generally, he seems to be accepted at the Berghof. So he's perhaps considered a kind of colonial upstart, not an established member of the European bourgeois, but still an acceptable person in society. So that's my personal theory on the matter. For me, this all elements that fit together, if we see in Peeperkorn as a synthesis of the East and the West, for which you would need a Dutchman in the European pre-war society. And that makes much more sense to me than focusing only on the external similarities with Gerhard Hauptmann. Okay, what else can be said about Peeperkorn and his demeanor? Most of it is very obvious. His linguistic incompetence, his incomplete sentences, this stammering, these wild gestures. But yet, paradoxically, all this has an overwhelming charismatic effect. So his commanding gestures are much more important than the content, which is non-existent. So he's a caricature of an irrational authority figure. And of course, this also casts a shadow of ridicule on everything that he celebrates and represents, but more on that later. A few more words about the other characters introduced along with Peeperkorn here. Right at the beginning of the episode, there's this Egyptian princess mentioned. Remember, she's the one from whom Behrens received this coffee set with erotic illustrations. I quote from the text, a sensational person with cropped hair and beringed fingers yellow with nicotine, who went about in a sack coat and well-pressed trousers, and who scorned the world of man, to lay hot and heavy, though fitful siege to an insignificant little Romanian Jewess. So a pretty clear allusion to a lesbian sexual orientation, I think, and she had among her little suite a Moorish eunuch. And so why the description of these three people here? My impression is that since these episodes about Mynheer Peeperkorn are all about physical pleasures, the corporal, the carnal things, the erotic and the sexual, also then the narrator is also creating a kind of a tableau here. He presents us with the whole panorama or portfolio of sexual orientations or sexual variations that was acceptable to be mentioned in a novel at that time. So we had heterosexuality and male homoeroticism in the novel, and now we have female homosexuality and also a special kind of sexuality, the physiologically impossible sexuality. So both of which, so the homosexual and the physically impossible sexuality, are infertile varieties of sexuality. So this is again Thomas Mann's tendency to paint an encyclopedic panorama. Now, with this pair of characters, he has prepared an ethnic spectrum of panorama, a skin color spectrum, and a spectrum of sexual orientation or sexual variation. And these are all aspects that are strongly related to, not to the intellectual, but to the physical dimension of human beings, to our bodies, not to the intellect, not to philosophy or to worldview, but to very bodily functions and properties. Okay, let's talk a bit about Claudia's role. I want to share a few observations about with you about Claudia. It's not surprising that she ostensibly ignores Hans. After all, she shows up at the Berghof with a new lover. But there are a few aspects of Claudia's behavior that caught my attention. Firstly, her androgynous features, they are emphasized once again. She was already part of an androgynous double image in the first part of the novel. So remember this old Hans, old schoolmate, Přibislav Hippe and Clawdia, they were reported to have the same eyes and the same voice. And so here the boyish element is emphasized once again by, for example, by the reference to the hat or the cap that Clawdia bought in Catalonia. It's called a boina, a cap that is explicitly mentioned as being actually a cap for men and for boys. So there's an element of cross-dressing that reinforces this gender ambiguity of Clawdia. However, this only applies to her outer appearance. Her actual behavior is not masculine and not. It's noticeable that her behavior is also has some ambiguity. It's relational or situationally adapted behavior, and it's not fixed to one specific role. She behaves in an almost maternally, caringly, feminine way towards Peeperkorn. He's a sick man, he's impotent, and she's taking care of him. To Hans, when he's alone, she's alternating between a dominant and seductive behavior, whatever route she takes, he is always the inferior. And if we take a look at the whole triangle, Clawdia, Peeperkorn, and Hans, she is the more passive and silent one. So Peeperkorn dominates. It is striking, for example, in the final scene of this third episode, when Peeperkorn asks Hans to kiss Clawdia on the forehead. Nothing at all is reported about her reaction. We learn about Hans' reaction, what he thinks, how he feels, what he says, but not a word, not a gesture, not a facial expression from Clawdia, nothing. And perhaps this underscores what was once called earlier in the novel her Asian passivity, so a somewhat formless, adaptable, or at least towards people who have a stronger will, such as Mynheer Peeperkorn. And this ambiguity is also evident in her accessories. So this cap, this Catalan Western boina, and the lacquered cigarette case with the Russian troika is also a male accessoire at that time. So she's also transgressive and ambiguous in these small personal items. And I don't know if it goes too far to interpret the troika, at least as a symbol of this emotional triangle or love triangle. So at the end of the episode, it becomes clear that Hans also submits to Peeperkorn with a certain amount of admiration, and he admires both Clawdia and Peeperkorn. And in later episodes, we will see that this love triangle or emotional triangle becomes even stronger, not in a really erotical sexual sense, but at least in emotionally. Another structural observation that I cannot interpret fully, but I simply take notice of it, is this conversation in the armchair or in the chair in the passageway to the piano room that seems to me to take on a kind of a leitmotif character. There, in the plush-covered armchair, in the sheltered corner of the room to the right of the portiere, there, in this setting, the confidential conversation between Hans and Clawdia took place earlier during this famous Walpurgis night. And again, in Vingt, Hans sits there. He sits there again, near the open passageway to the piano room, with his back to the door on a plush-covered Renaissance chair. So very similar setting. And also a nice detail. Also, the last conversation between Joachim and Marussia, it also took place in such an armchair scene, in such an area of the Berghof. So Marussia sits in the armchair, and Joachim leans over her from behind and talks to her. And the current conversation between Hans and Clawdia seems to mirror that conversation between Joachim and Marussia. Now the man is sitting, and the woman Clawdia is leaning over him from behind. And Joachim's image is not only evoked in the reader's head by the configuration of the figures, but Joachim is also the actual starting point of the conversation now between Clawdia and Hans. So so the memory of Joachim and of his love that was doomed to failure, this is evoked here in a twofold way. Probably this is not a very good omen. Okay. Let's move on to the fifth chapter, so this Bacchanal in the episode 21. I think it's clear to almost every reader that something decisive happens in this episode with this spontaneous feast or Bacchanal directed by Mynheer Peeperkorn. It is a burlesque scene, as unrestrained as the Walpurgis night. And I think the title alone makes it clear that this is a scene of a great symbolic significance. 21, it's not only the name of a card game played here, but it's of course French, and French is the language of love between Hans and Clawdia. You may remember that the entire intimate dialogue between the two in the Walpurgis night episode took place in French, and 21 just means 21. So, and 21 is 3 times 7. So, and we know that Thomas Mann loved to play with the number 7 as a marker of significance. And say here, so 7 multiplied by the Trinity number 3, that is that's highly symbolic. And this is actually the third episode in the 7th chapter. So again, 7 and 3, 7 times 3, 21, 21. Beautifully done, Thomas. Okay, so then there is this actual feast or bacchanal or this orgy. So Peeperkorn is the master of ceremonies who directs everything. He gives orders, he rejects food of low quality, he issues new orders, he tolerates no contradiction at all. He demands everyone's full attention and participation and devoted participation in this excess. He demands full devotion. No one is allowed to escape his dictates of enjoyment. And because enjoyment is not a playful thing, it's actually a serious matter. It's almost a sacred duty. And so he's a very different teacher from Nafta and Settembrini. For him, it is all about physicality. All intellectuality is eliminated. It is about simple enjoyment and not sophisticated things and not sophisticated talk. And this also applies to the way he's trying to justify this approach. So the ideological background and justification has to be formulated in a very simple way. So when Hans gets carried away with somewhat pretentious talk about the philosophy behind this, maybe with the aim to impress Peeperkorn or perhaps to impress Clawdia, Peeperkorn doesn't appreciate this very at all. So Hans can only avoid a tempest, a storm with some difficulty by quickly steering the conversation back to more simple matters, to talking about the simple joys of drinking wine or something like that. So, and but despite all the emphasis on culinary treats, it becomes clear in Peeperkorn's speeches, however disjointed they may be, that he is basically he's driven by fear. It's the fear of no longer being able to meet the demands of life, to meet the demands of enjoying life, of no longer being able to live up to the expectations. And this is also repeatedly and quite clearly related to the sphere of sexuality. It can be read directly as a fear of an impending impotence, like what from the text the claims, the holy, the feminine claims life makes upon manly honor and strength. So life and women, that they merge here into a kind of deity that one man must serve. Life as sprawling females, she challenges us to expand our manhood to its uttermost span, to stand or fall before her. Again, I think very clear erotic connotations, to stand or fall before this naked woman. So the failure to enjoy life means impotence. Quote again from the text: shame and ignominy are soft words for the ruin and bankruptcy, the horrible disgrace. It is the end of everything, the hellish despair, the judgment day. So that impotence, so that's the fatal blow to any man. So Peeperkorn's entire speech remains a bit ambiguous, like a tightrope walk. So is it about the enjoyment of life in general, or is it especially about sexual impotence? Of course, the narrator, Thomas Mann, does not make this explicit, so that is not his style. But I think through the way Peeperkorn is introduced, through this tableau of various forms of sexuality that is painted at the beginning of the Peeperkorn episode, the sexual undercurrent and the sexual connotation of everything he says and does, I think that's quite obvious. So Hans is fascinated by all this. He enjoys this revelry in the moment. He enjoys the drinking camaraderie. He carries favor. He cannot escape it. He even addresses Peeperkorn as majesty. only at the last moment does he dare to some insubordination, this refusal to obey orders when Peeperkorn asks him to kiss Clawdia on the forehead. So now we have essentially gone through the plot of the feast, but we have omitted a very few crucial aspects of the way this scene is narrated, because I think that's quite interesting. This is linking back to the general aspects of religious studies that I was mentioning earlier. There are two religious mythological structures here that are beautifully intertwined and mixed in the way that this scene is narrated. In this Bacchanal scene, it intertwines a Christian, Christological element and an ancient Dionysian one. So now I'm going to come back to what I said at the beginning of the episode, when I was talking about the episode, so By the Ocean of Time. So there the narrator already set out the theoretical framework for what happens here in this Bacchanal, in this orgy. The narrator mentioned this very special view of time, which I explained as being linked to this religious concept of nunc stans or tempus ille, this Latin terms developed by the doctor Thomas Aquinas to describe this divine time, a timeless eternity, eternal present, this dimension beyond time in which, according to religious studies, so this truth represented by myth are located. So, and reenacting a myth or performing a religious ritual means bringing this to mind. It means reactualizing a truth that is beyond time, that is part of this eternal present, but bringing it into our human presence. So from a religious studies perspective, this is what lies behind the central rituals of most religions. Through this reactualization or bringing to mind of a mythological or historical event or an act that constitutes a specific religion, through this reactualization, it becomes possible for the participants, for the believer, to participate in this, in the deeper meaning of this myth or this ritual. So this is the actual meaning of religious rites performed in certain annual cycles, for example. So now this is a very abstract view that applies to many religions in general, from ancient mystery plays such as the Greek Dionysian cults or the Roman Saturnalia to the rituals of today's religions. To make it more concrete and specific with an example, we also know this from Christianity. For example, according to the traditional Catholic understanding, the Catholic Mass is precisely this. It's a reactualization, a representation, Latin representatio, not a repetition, a reactualization of a unique event of timeless significance. The sacrifice of Christ is not actually performed anew as a repetition in every Mass, in the sense of repeating something, because it's an event, a unique event that took place one. But what happens in the Mass is it's an event, it's a reactualization of this event of eternal significance, and so it is made by this act of reactualization. This event beyond time is made present in every Mass, thereby enabling the participating believers to share in this redemptive effect. So this is a subtle but important difference in religious studies between this concept of reactualization and a simple repetition. So that's not the same. Whereas reactualization is actually making a bridge, a link from our human time, which is flowing to this eternal event in an eternal present. So, and the narrator alludes to this redemptive mechanism of myth, religion, and ritual when he refers to the doctor, to Thomas Aquinas, when speaking in the first episode of this chapter of the teachers of the Middle Ages, and that the true being of things is a standing now and eternal present. Behind these sentences, there's this idea. So this concept of the two different types of time is crucial and central to understanding the effect of both ancient myth and Christian doctrine of salvation. And more on this, as I mentioned, can be found in relevant religious studies literature, such as the works of Mircea Eliade, who was able to describe this in a way that is also accessible to a non-specialist. And it is precisely this kind of religious, mythological visualization and reactualization that is depicted and displayed in Mynheer Peeperkorn's Bacchanal. And I deliberately say religious and mythological because these two European traditions are mixed here. The Christian one with allusions to the Last Supper, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Judas' betrayal of Jesus, which is or the beginning of the Passion of Christ, and the second one, the ancient Greek tradition, the cult of Dionysus, a festival of the senses, of intoxication, sacred intoxication as a tribute to and recognition of the deities of life. So it's a reference back to historical or mythological events, but through their reenactment or more precisely to their reactualization through their. Okay, let us examine the two dimensions mixed together here, Dionysian and Christian elements. So two preliminary remarks on this Dionysian element. The idea that the European history and mentality were essentially shaped by the interaction and conflict between two principles rooted in antiquity. This idea goes back to the German philosopher Nietzsche, who had strong influence on Thomas Mann. And these two principles described by Nietzsche were the Dionysian principle, so that's the principle of ecstasy, of transgression, of intoxication, excess, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Apollonian principle, moderation, restraint, harmony, structure, order, and form. And so this also has a historical core. In ancient times, there actually were so-called Dionysia, so that were Bacchanalian celebrations lasting several days in honor of the god of wine and intoxication. These were feasts during which collective intoxication was supported, and it was supposed to remove the boundaries between God and humanity, and also between the individuals of the community. So, and what Peeperkorn stages and directs here, it clearly has some Dionysian traits. Right? Intoxication as a breaking down of boundaries. So Peeperkorn enforces excessive alcohol consumption. The community becomes uninhibited and intimate. People fraternize. Mrs. Magnus sits on Mr. Albin's lap, and Mr. Wesal's sobbing is respected as something sacred. And it's all rather about the body rather than the mind. So Peeperkorn convinces, not through his intellect, through logical arguments, but through his physical presence, his gestures and his charisma, his majestic demeanor and his facial expressions. And there's this, it's a sacralization of carnal pleasure. Eating and drinking are not profane acts, but through Peeperkorn's way of introducing it, it takes on an almost sacred character. It's almost like a holy service to life. And then there's this element of the tyranny of collective boundlessness and transgression. No one is allowed to escape the ritual. Peeperkorn demands unconditional devotion to this collective ecstasy. But then there's also, this is the Dionysian part, and then there's also the other side. Thomas Mann also plays with references to the central events of Christianity, the Last Supper, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus withdraws to pray just a few hours before it's then betrayed by Judas and arrested by the Roman soldiers. So examples how this is linked to in the texts, there are 12 of them. So just like Jesus and his disciples at the Last Supper, after the traitor Judas left the group. And also here in the novel, 12 people sat down. And incidentally, all 12 are named. It's Peeperkorn, Clawdia, Hans, Mr. Ferge, Mr. Wesal, Mr. Albin, Mr. Paravant, Mr. and Mrs. Magnus, Mrs. Stör, Hermine Kleefeld, and the Dr. Ting Fu. And there's Peeperkorn, who refers to the individual dishes with meaningful words, just as Jesus refers to the significance of bread and wine in this so-called words of institution in the Christian tradition. So Peeperkorn is introducing these elements here with important words. And then there's the reference to the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Peeperkorn quotes directly from the Bible. And he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee with him, and so on. And for those who are not so familiar with the Christian Gospels, after the Last Supper, Jesus goes with his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's a sort of public green space in Jerusalem, public garden. And so because Jesus knows what lies ahead, and so he seeks prayer to find some comfort. And all 11 remaining disciples, they accompany him to the garden, but then when they are about to enter the garden, Jesus only takes Peter and the two sons of Zebedee So John and James with him inside the garden, because these three, they sort of form the inner circle. And unfortunately, so Jesus is praying, and he's questioning his Father, is it really necessary that I have to go through all this passion? And so, but the three, they fall asleep while Jesus is in prayer repeatedly. And then Jesus has to admonish them several times. Can't you even watch with me 1 hour? And Peeperkorn uses the very same reproach when the first participants in his gluttonous orgy, they begin to weaken. So he stages himself sometimes as a Dionysus and sometimes as a Christ figure here. And perhaps the end of the scene can also be read as an allusion to the Passion story, the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. The scene in the garden ends with Judas, the traitor, kissing Jesus as a sign to the Roman soldiers of who they are to arrest. Which one of these 11 people is Jesus? So, and the end of the episode 21 also involves a kiss, but there's another ironic twist, because this is a kiss that reveals something, because it is not given. And it is not given because Hans would consider it inappropriate, or he would consider it a kind of betrayal. So the elements of disclosure, betrayal, and they are involved here, linked to the kiss, but and like in the story of Jesus, but in a twisted way. Another observation that shows how these two levels, the ancient mythological and the Christian one, are meaningfully interwoven down to the smallest details, is that after 800 pages in the novel, we learn the name of the female dwarf who serves in the dining room. And we learn that her name is Emerentia. So, and we learn this only now because Peeperkorn asks for it. So he's the first to take an interest in this lady. So I think this is, her name is highly, her being a servant and a dwarf is highly symbolic. On the one hand, the name fits perfectly at the surface of the plot, because Emerentia means the serving one. So this is actually what this woman is all about. She not only brings food every day to all the Berghof patients, but she also makes this Bacchanal possible, because she organizes that the kitchen staff is working again, and she is carrying all the food to the table. And then, according to the Christian legend, Emerentia is the grandmother of Mary. So that means that makes her the great grandmother of Jesus. So her name thus evokes the genealogy of Christ. But it's also significant on the level of the Dionysus myth. It's in the way of the mythological way of thinking. Let's put it that way, because it is more or less a basic rule in mythology, a basic rule in any myth, that there is hardly any nameless figure in a myth. Almost every person who is mentioned is a clearly identifiable individualized character, usually identified by a specific name. So, and this is makes sense. It's quite understandable in terms of how references to myth function in a culture. As a rule, mentioning or quoting just the name of a person from a myth should be enough to evoke the central message of the myth, or the function of the person. If you talk of a Sisyphus, of a Penelope, of an Orpheus, or an Icarus, the name is sufficient. The name alone gives the clear message. So that's how mythology works. All the key figures already have a name. The name carries a meaning. Of course, there are some exceptions, but as a general rule of thumb, it can say that almost all figures in a myth need to have an individual name. So, and if there is no name, so it needs to be invented. So, and so far, so if we stage this whole setting as a mythological scene, then it's possible, it's necessary that the dwarf also has a personal name. And as I mentioned, if there's, we can see this in tradition, that if there's no name, a name needs to be invented, and it will be invented. We can see this need for individual names for the transmission of significant events. We can see this very clearly in the Christian tradition. in those places where the original tradition does not mention a name. And then an apocryphal tradition quickly emerges. For example, the three wise men from the East who visited the baby Jesus. They are anonymous in the Bible. Then the names Caspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, they were developed from the 6th century onwards. It's clear that these are the three names of the three wise men who visited baby Jesus. Or there's a Roman soldier, or to be more precise, the centurion, who stood beneath Jesus' cross and who exclaimed, "Oh, truly, this was the Son of God." In the Bible, he has no name, but he was later given the name Longinus, etc. So, what does all this mean? I think that following the offers of a worldview provided by Settembrini, humanism and freedom and liberty, and a worldview offered by NAFTA, metaphysics, radical social restructuring, now a third offer is made here. And so hence this is the role of Peeperkorn as a third teacher or third mentor, and the proposal from his side is quite different. It's salvation through devotion to life in the here and now. So sensible, proper time management through full enjoyment of the moment, full mindfulness, but also enjoying all the material things. So with simple pleasures, but to the excess. And these two facets, on the one hand, salvation, that is an ultimate offer of meaning in life, and on the other hand, a very worldly, pleasure-oriented way of living to the point of ecstasy. This is how I believe this representation or reactualization of Christian salvation and the ancient pagan myth of Dionysus can be read here. This is why all these two elements are intertwined here. In other words, so this feast as an attempt or an offer of a secularized form of salvation. And the narrator stages this in a highly symbolic and meaningful way as a reactualization or a re-representation of both the Christian Passion and the Dionysian Bacchanal. So we will probably see in the next two episodes how convincing this concept is for Hans and how viable it is for Peeperkorn. But okay, 6th chapter, let's summarize again the core thesis or key points of my interpretation so far. First one is a key element is the theme of time. In the walk by the ocean of time, the reader is prepared for the appearance of Mynheer Peeperkorn, and this section also teaches the reader this distinction between pathological and authentic perception of time, and proper time management also introduces this concept of aesthetic dimension of time as a standing now or an eternal present. This is introduced here. And second is we learn something about the narrator's opinion and position. So we have this first explicit judgments of some characters in favor of Settembrini and Joachim, but against NAFTA, who is twice condemned without mentioning his name, condemned as a proponent of the evil principle and someone who introduces intellectual confusion. Then Peeperkorn is introduced as the third teacher or third mentor with his hedonistic vitalism as an alternative to Settembrini's rationalism and NAFTA's mysticism and metaphysics. And this is done in several ways. So in terms of content, Peeperkorn's attitude is characterized by living in the here and now, enjoying the pleasures of life in the present. In the terms of the narrative technique, the high significance of Peeperkorn and his attitude is emphasized through this combination of Christological and Dionysian features, this unique combination of vitalism and salvation. And so this strange promise of redemption through intoxication and through pleasure and physicality. But it's also connected with an elemental fear, a fear of no longer having the strength to fulfill the sacred duties of life, the claims of life. And this is considered the ultimate failure of Judgment Day. And there are also some connotations to sexual impotence here. Number 4 is the element of number symbolism. 21 means 21. It's 3 times 7, the third teacher, and the third episode in the 7th chapter. It's a typical playful approach of Thomas Mann to this number 7. And then there's this element of ambivalence. Thomas Mann shows both, or fascination and criticism. So by portraying Peeperkorn as a character bordering on caricature, by doing this, he also makes it clear how questionable this promise of salvation offered by excess and vitalism, how questionable this is. And number 6, there's this open question. Is this a sound and solid offer as a helpful worldview, as the right path to salvation or to a fulfilling life? Or is this vitalism also doomed to failure? Or let's break it down and condense it again into 2 sentences. So the first 3 episodes of chapter 7 show the last attempt to find an alternative to Settembrini and Nafta's failed educational project, a third way between reason and metaphysics, a way through vitalistic enjoyment of the present. And for the first time, the narrator clearly takes a stand for Settembrini and Joachim and against Nafta, but leaving the viability of Peeperkorn's model of life as an open question. Final chapter of the video, a bonus chapter. A bonus is a digression on Olga Tokarczuk's novel Empusion, for those of you who have read this novel, because I think I explained it earlier in one of the previous videos that Olga Tokarczuk's novel Empusion is also an intelligent and humorous homage to the novel The Magic Mountain, turned inside out with a specific feminist attitude. I have already made a specific video about this novel by Olga Tokarczuk, a video in which I first analyze and praise the novel as a work in its own right. But in the second part, I also highlight the most important references to The Magic Mountain. And now when I read the current parts of The Magic Mountain, these episodes, I noticed some additional references that Empusion makes to The Magic Mountain, but these are things that I have not mentioned in my original video on Empusion. So here we go. And it's just 2 very little things, but for those of you who have read Empusion, it might be interesting. On the occasion of the 2 names we just talked about, the name of the dwarf Emerentia and this Roman soldier Longinus. Here's a little additional digression on Empusion. The first character of Emerentia also appears in Olga Tokarczuk's novel, but not as a living person, but as a picture, as a religious picture, an icon in a chapel that is visited by the main characters. And in this chapel, there is an icon of the type Emerentia with Anne, Mary, and Jesus. And this is an iconographic representation that is widespread in multiple versions, a representation of the genealogy, of the lineage of Christ back to his great-grandmother Emerentia, who is, so to speak, the super mother of Christianity. So, and these icons, Emerentia and Mary and Jesus, they are usually structured in such a way that Christ is depicted as the smallest figure in front, as a baby sitting on Mary's lap, and Mary, in turn, is also sitting on the lap of her mother, or she is held from behind by her mother, Anne. And in the background behind Anne, towering above everyone, is Anna's mother, Emerentia. And so in this icon, Emerentia is the huge figure in the back, and the Christ figure is the small baby. So what Tokarczuk describes here, when she describes this icon and gives this icon a special role in the chapter, that's really a clever reversal of the system of power and civic significance, as we see it in the Magic Mountain here. In the Magic Mountain, Peeperkorn, who he's performing himself as a Christ figure, he is the towering authority in the background, while Emerentia is the serving dwarf at the bottom of the hierarchy, small and relatively insignificant. By referring to this Emerentia icon, Tokarczuk now alludes to an image in which the proportions are actually reversed. So the Christ figure is the helpless infant, and Emerentia is no longer the marginalized dwarf, but she is the gigantic, towering bearer, the enabler of the entire Christology. So somewhat maliciously, one could say Tokarczuk plants the idea in our heads that, from a feministic perspective, Peeperkorn, who is setting himself in, performing himself like a Christ-like figure, he is actually just a drooling or babbling infant, depending on being fed, while the dwarf Emerentia is the actual giant, the true female power, the origin and sustainer of everything. The second point about the Roman soldier Longinus, or do you say Longinus in English? I don't know. So the name Longinus, I stick with the German way for pronunciation, the name Longinus does not appear in the Magic Mountain, not at all. I only mentioned this name earlier as an example of how both in myth and in historically transmitted key narratives of religions, key figures cannot remain nameless. And when no name has been historically transmitted, then an apocryphal name tradition emerges usually. However, the name Longinus is actually used by Tokarczuk, so which is why I'm taking it up here. In Mr. Opitz's house in Empusion, there is a patient named Longinus Lucas, who is definitely one of the patients with a more prominent role here. And by giving him this way, Tokarczuk clearly indicates that she too is taking up the tradition of alluding to the passion story, and he is well aware of the way how mythology works and the need to give names to people. I mentioned Longinus as the name given retrospectively to the centurion beneath Jesus' cross, and actually this story of this Roman soldier beneath the cross of Jesus, the story is told in the Gospel of Luke. So Longinus Lucas, so Lucas is the Germanized version of Luke. So yeah, it's very clear when she could not hold up the sign more clearly. Attention, allusion to the passion of Christ. So this was just a very small and insignificant digression into other links between Olga Tokarczuk's novel Empusion and Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain. Whatever. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If so, let me know in the comments. Also, your point of view, what you understood of these episodes. I'm looking very much forward to your comments. And yeah, the next video will go online in about 2 to 3 weeks, and it will be about the final 2 episodes on Mynheer Peeperkorn. And yeah, and until then, have a great reading time. Take care, bye-bye, and ciao.